Okay, welcome. We are going to talk about cellular respiration. This is the last lecture for this unit, photosynthesis and respiration. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and start with the graphic. This is an equation for both photosynthesis and respiration, and it's always good to compare because it is a continuous cycle. So we can see from the input of photosynthesis, we have carbon dioxide, water, and we have light energy. It's going to produce glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen. And then when we compare that to the cellular respiration, we see that the products of one become the reactants of the other. And then vice versa. The products of respiration becomes the reactants of photosynthesis. So that's why it's a continuous cycle. And so photosynthesis would be found in plants, and aerobic respiration are found in all living organisms, such as ourselves. So respiration, cellular respiration, let's take a look at the definition. It is the process that releases chemical energy. And in this case, the chemical energy is going to be glucose. The glucose that we acquired from eating a plant, and then we are going to burn that sugar in addition to the oxygen that the plant gives off. So just here's a diagram. One thing, not only, and I've been saying this for some time now, knowing what goes in, what comes out, but also the organelles that these processes take place in. So photosynthesis, we've been talking about the chloroplast, which is found only in plants. And we can tell here, we should recognize this. These are thylakoid membranes, and a stack is called a grana or granum. And so the key factor is sunlight coming in. And if I follow this diagram, oxygen and glucose is going to be given off. Then we're going to move over to the mitochondria. And we know that the mitochondria is the energy or the powerhouse of the cell. And we learned that from our cells unit. And thing that is given off, if we go back to our equation, is carbon dioxide and water. And then that's going to continue the cycle as we go through. And we can also see when it goes through cellular respiration, a couple of other molecules that's given off is ATP, which is used to power all the cells and all the organelles, and also heat is given off into the environment. So we need to break down cellular respiration. There are actually two types of cellular respiration. We have aerobic, and I'm sure you've heard of aerobics. That is with oxygen, so it needs oxygen in order to continue the process. The second is anaerobic. Anytime you see an in front of a term, that means no or not. So this process does not require oxygen. So let's break this down a little bit more. So let's look at each one. So aerobic respiration, if we go back to our diagram, we see that we've got glucose or sugar coming in, and we've got oxygen from the air. Respiration is taking place in like mammals and organisms, okay? And we're going to do this in the mitochondria, and that would be this entire structure here is the cell. And so this little dot here, it's kind of hard to see, is the mitochondria. So that is aerobic respiration with the use of oxygen and glucose to carry out the process. The second is anaerobic. So we don't need oxygen to carry out this process. And that is actually broken down into two types of anaerobic respiration. Make sure you know this. And we call that fermentation. Okay? So know that these are synonymous with one another, so to speak. There are two types of fermentation or anaerobic respiration. The first one, and this is in no particular order, is alcoholic, and the second is lactic acid. So let's take a look at the alcoholic fermentation first. So let's just jump down to the bottom so we can see, well, where do these processes take place? Well, alcoholic fermentation, that process is used to help to make bread, beer, wine. And then for lactic acid, we experience that if you work out and then you're really tired the next day, you have a buildup of lactic acid on your muscles and it creates a soreness. Another place you would find lactic acid fermentation is in yogurt, when you make yogurt. And you don't need to know this, but when you mix lactose and water and then the bacteria, there's our living organism, is going to produce the lactic acid, and it gives it that bitter taste. So let's compare the two. There are some similarities. So the first big one, and make sure you know this, would be this one right here. That to get these two types of anaerobic respiration, these two types of fermentation started, it has to have something called pyruvic acid. You may also see it called pyruvate. Either term is fine with me. It just depends on the textbook you pick up. So that is the biggest similarity between the two. And then the difference, besides where you would find it, would be what does it make? So alcoholic fermentation makes ethyl alcohol. Make sure you have that word ethyl in front of it. There's a lot of different alcohols. And the other is carbon dioxide. And that's why you see bread rise. It's that bubbles that is created and the bubbles are popping. And so if you ever look at bread real carefully, you'll see little holes in it. And so that is the carbon dioxide, the gases, and then the heat is going to cause it to pop. And then I've already talked about the lactic acid in your sore muscles. So it's going to make the lactic acid. Here's just a little bit different diagram. I'm not going to read this in the corner here. You can take a look at that. But we've got glucose coming in. Okay, and here's the different stages. So here's that pyruvate or pyruvic acid I was talking about. And then it can go to two different pathways, depending if we have oxygen or we don't have oxygen. So if we have oxygen, it's going to go to the mitochondria, and we'd already talked about that, where then it will go through the processes, and the big thing is it's going to make ATP. And then if it's anaerobic, the two types of fermentation, it's going to either make ethyl alcohol, alcoholic fermentation, or it's going to make lactic acid. So you can pause that just to take a look at it a little more carefully. You also see a couple other molecules, and these should be familiar. We've got ATP and we have the NADH. And we remember that we saw that in our light reactions, but it's also going to take place here. These are just these carrier molecules. Here's just another diagram. So fermentation is in the absence, another way to say it is absence of oxygen. The pyruvic acid or pyruvate is converted. So here's my glycolysis right here. That's kind of a big one. And then what it makes at each one. So it's going to make some ATP here. Here's the pyruvic acid or pyruvate. So without oxygen, with oxygen. And so we're not going to get into the oxidative respiration, but know if it takes a pathway of using oxygen, the aerobic respiration, that it makes the most ATP. So I've been talking about glycolysis, and I'm going to break this diagram down in just a moment. So we need to know where it takes place. It takes place in the cytoplasm. So far, this unit, we've talked about the chloroplast, we've talked about the mitochondria, and now we have the cytoplasm. So these are our big players where we're going to see photosynthesis and respiration. So glycolysis does not require oxygen, just like when we talk about the types of respiration, anaerobic respiration does not require oxygen. The main thing with glycolysis is it's going to start both types of respiration, both anaerobic and aerobic respiration. So this diagram here shows this top part is glycolysis. So it's going to take the glucose molecule. Remember, we're in respiration right now. So it's going to take glucose, and eventually we're going to get down to, and here is the pyruvic acid or pyruvate. And then this will move down into the anaerobic respiration or fermentation. And these are the two pathways. And I've already gone over the yeast, and I've talked about our muscles, how we get sore. So here's lactic acid produced. Ethanol is also referred to as ethyl alcohol. I'm just going to abbreviate here, okay? And then it also gives off some carbon dioxide. So anaerobic respiration does take place in the mitochondria. So this little organelle structure should look familiar. I'm not going to read all this to you, so you may want to pause to take a look at that, or you can look in your guided lecture notes. But I want to point it out that sometimes it's referred to as the currency of the cell. But when we talk about the metabolic activities, okay, that's the aerobic respiration that's going on, kind of like the metabolism. So don't be thrown by that word metabolic activities. Okay, so now here's something new, and this is called the Krebs cycle. So this is a pathway that you will find in aerobic respiration. So we're digging a little bit deeper. Krebs cycle is also referred to as the citric acid cycle. And the reason why is because it's going to produce citric acid. And it also produces a lot of other molecules. One thing I want you to pick out from this, and there's a lot of diagrams, it's more technical than this, but the big things is it's going to make citric acid. That's why it's called citric acid cycle. Got carbon dioxide, okay? It's going to be released a couple different places. You'll probably notice, though, we have some hydrogen carrier molecules, okay? So those should look familiar. I tried to find the simplest diagram I could. There are some technical ones that actually breaks out the structural molecule for each part. So Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle, and then along the way it releases ATP, carbon dioxide, and the hydrogen carrier molecule. Now this diagram seems a little overwhelming, so if you need to pause to kind of look at everything and digest it, I really liked it because I like the symbols. It shows kind of like a battery, because I don't know if you've heard me refer to it like ATP is kind of like a rechargeable battery, and kind of the same thing for the hydrogen carrier molecule. So let's start right here. And the light dependent reactions is also referred to as light reaction. And so this is photosynthesis right here. I've got my sunlight coming in. I've got my water coming in. Okay, ATP is given off. Here is my, it should look familiar from our activity. Here's the hydrogen ions, the electrons, the hydrogen carrier molecule. Then we're going to move into the light independent. So that's the dark reactions, okay, also called the Calvin cycle. We have carbon dioxide coming in, okay, and it's going to make glucose. And the other thing that I need to mention from the light dependent or the light reactions is oxygen given off into the atmosphere, which is going to come down for the electron transport chain. Let's jump over to this side over here, okay, so I can get rid of all this. There we go. So now the Krebs cycle, we're in anaerobic respiration, which is in the mitochondria. So we've got our glucose molecule right here, and we've got some ATP and some NAD, which needs to be recharged. So it's going to go through the process of glycolysis. Here's the pyruvic acid or pyruvate. Glycolysis is also going to produce ATP. It's going to recharge that hydrogen carrier molecule to NADH. It's going to go through the citric acid cycle 2 times, and then from there, it's going to make some more ATP. We can go back to our diagram and take a look at everything it makes, and of course, the citric acid. So this kind of puts all of our processes together into one diagram. Just another diagram. One thing I wanted to point out on this particular slide is right here. ATP is the big one, so we're in the mitochondria. So where does all this ATP come from? So glycolysis is going to make 2 ATP molecules. Krebs cycle is going to make 2. The biggest one is the electron transport chain. So a total, when it goes through these processes one time, it's going to make 38 ATP. And so 38 molecules of ATP may not sound like a lot, but when that's happening in all of the mitochondria in every cell of your body, that's a lot. This particular image takes from what you learned last semester on energy, food chains and food webs, and links it to photosynthesis and respiration, how they all interconnect. So we can see if we just look at a food chain, so we have our sun, we have our plants carrying out photosynthesis, and then we have our consumers and decomposers carrying out respiration. Heat is given off into the environment, and so we can see how they all link together. So hopefully this clears things up. I know the Krebs cycle and some of these other cycles can be a little bit overwhelming. And again, I'm just focusing on what goes in, what comes out, how everything cycles together, how everything is linked together, and then where do they take place? What organelles inside the cell? So this is kind of the end of it. So if you have any questions, just see me in class.